Well, welcome. Thank you very much for coming to this press conference. This, of course, is about getting Bill 74 passed, not just by second reading, we hope, but actually into law. And I just want to say a couple of words about that. It seems almost redundant that we are tabling this bill for second reading because we actually have been observing a moment of silence at Queen's Park for the last 2 years, actually 3 years, counting this year, and also raised the trans flag on November 20th. But here's the catch, here's the problem, and here's why it needs to be made law. There's an election coming up. We don't know who's going to be sitting in the government seat. After that election, we don't know what the makeup of the MPPs will be. We need to make it very clear to future MPPs and to future governments in the province of Ontario that it's important that it is, in fact, the law to remember the Trans Day of Remembrance and to observe it here. To help me do that, we have two incredible folk here, not strangers to anyone in this place. Susan Gapka, Chair of the Toronto Trans Coalition and Chair of Trans Lobby Group, and Helen Kennedy, who's a Canadian rock star at this point after the apology in Ottawa, which truly was a momentous and historic moment in this country. She, of course, is the Executive Director of Egal Canada, founded in 1986 to advance equality for Canadian lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people and their families across Canada. So welcome both. And Susan, we'll start with you.
Well, just want to thank you, Cheri, for the wonderful introduction, and how lucky can I be to be sitting between these two amazing activists and allies and supporters of trans communities.
I thought you were going to say rose between two thorns.
I got to just make sure we got the mic going on there. So transgender, I don't know if you know this, but Transgender Day of Remembrance, also known as TDOR, and I'm going to use that because we're short on time, was started in 1999 by Gwendolyn Ann Smith as a vigil to honor the memory of Rita Hester, a transgender woman who was killed in 1998. The vigil commemorated all transgendered women lost to violence since Rita Hester's death and began as an important tradition that has become annual Trans Day of Remembrance. Smith says, TDOR seeks to highlight the losses we face due to anti-transgender bigotry and violence. I am no stranger to the need to fight for our rights. The right to exist is first and foremost. Sometimes with so many seeking to erase transgender people, sometimes in the most brutal way possible, it is vitally important that we remember those we lose and we continue to fight for justice. In Toronto in 1998, a man killed 3 women on Victoria Day in one night. These murders were connected only by the man's violence against women and the fact these women were sex workers. 2 of them were trans, 1 was cisgendered. The first Canadian TDOR was organized in 2001 in Vancouver. By 2004, memorials were held in Edmonton, St. John's, Ottawa, Toronto, and at Brock University in St. Catharines. On November 18th, 2004, we rallied over at the University of Toronto, marched to Queen's Park, and petitioned that the Minister of Health and Long-Term Care fund transition-related surgeries. At the 519, Kyle Scanlon hosted the first annual Trans Day of Remembrance in Toronto. It's Toronto's signature event. Today, TDOR is a day to memorialize all of those who have died because they either identified as trans, non-binary, genderqueer, drag queens, cross-dressers, or their gender identity and expressions differed from stereotypical norms. It must be recognized that trans women of color experience the highest levels of violence, and the list continues to grow longer. Trans Day of Remembrance is an opportunity for us to reflect on larger social issues while thinking about how intersectionality impacts all of our lives. The vigil often includes a reading of a list of names who have died in the last year, and in last year, 2017, up to up to November 20th, over 270 people are on that list. With Brazil being the highest, having the highest murder rate. In Toronto, there's a woman named Elora who's been missing for 3 months, and we have no sign of her, and we fear about her well-being. Here at the legislature, though, you can support trans and non-binary communities by adopting Bill 74, which is what we're here to discuss, which would recognize November 20th annually with a commemoration to honor all those lives that were lost to anti-trans hatred and violence. While vigils are typically hosted by local activists like Boyd Kodak of the Toronto Trans Alliance, who'll be here later today, or the 519, you can play a role. You can play a role as an important ally this afternoon in the legislature. You know, later this year, as Cheri said, there'll be a new cohort of MPs taking their seats. Some will get re-elected, some are retiring, and we do not want to erase the hard work that we've accomplished these last decades of educating new MPPs on trans rights. For example, we've had the Rainbow Health Ontario, we've funded the transition-related surgeries, legal documents, Toby's Act, the Trans Inmate Policy, just last year, Cy and Ruby's Act to include trans people and families, and conversion therapy. And with the help of these wonderful activists on either side, we've been a wonderful team bringing that forward. Fabulous, actually, I think. So let's work together to remind Ontario and our trans non-binary communities are included, that people like our communities are included, that we are loved and that we are protected. We are seeking your support for Bill 74 in second reading this afternoon.
Thank you, Susan. Helen.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Cheri, for the opportunity to be here today. And thank you, Susan, for reminding us of some of the horrific incidents that have occurred to trans people, not only around the world, but here in Canada as well. I think sometimes we separate what's happening to trans people who are some of the most marginalized people in our society. And we think that it's not occurring here in Canada. And it's not until you hear the stories that you understand and realize that trans people are probably some of the most marginalized in our society. We know from the work that we do at EGAL through our climate survey of homophobia and transphobia and biphobia in our Canadian schools that trans people are afraid to go to school. They're being victimized every single day. There's sexual assaults in bathrooms of young children by their fellow students because of their identities. There are parents who have to go to school at recess to take their child out to use the bathroom at the local gas station because the teachers and the schools will not provide the facilities for the non-binary and transgender children. That's happening here, it's happening in this city, and it's happening across the country. The importance of what Cheri is doing here today to enshrine Bill 74 into legislation has not only domestic impacts, but it also has global rippling effect. There is no legislation around the world that will enshrine Trans Day of Remembrance as part of a government recognition. And the importance of that shouldn't be lost on us, because what it does is it recognizes the violence against a group in our society, but it also makes us aware and allows us to start talking about the children who are directly impacted, about the health impacts on trans people who are marginalized, about the impacts around employment, around housing. Some of the highest rates of homelessness in Toronto are amongst our trans populations. In Toronto currently we have 23% of the homeless youth population identify as LGBTQI2S. So this legislation will go beyond recognizing the horror of the murders and the deaths of innocent people because of their identities, and it will allow us to start talking about how we can make systemic change to be more inclusive and aware of the impacts of gender identity, gender expression on people, on our healthcare system, on our employment system, on our labor laws, on our justice system. So it's a very broad piece of legislation. So I want us to look at the broad components of the legislation, as well as the awareness piece and the recognition piece. And I want us to show the global community that Canada is taking a lead on this issue. I think we showed that this week, and I want to continue that trend. And there's no better place to start than with Cheri, because she has absolutely been a pioneer in advancing queer rights in this country. So thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Just one word, and then I'll open it up for questions. Certainly, we're still fighting on. Susan mentioned some of the legislation we've had. Toby's Act, for example, took 5 tablings, 6 years before we got all-party support. Banning conversion therapy, that was inspired by a trans group, TG Interselves, and I want to put their name out there, from Sudbury, incredible group of pioneers up there. And just this Monday, Joshua Armstrong came to Queen's Park looking for a birth certificate that reflected their non-binary status, and was told that they would have to wait till the spring. Despite the fact that Toby's Act, which guarantees human rights for people of different gender identities and expressions, was passed 6 years ago. So there's so much work left to do, and I think Helen touched on that. I think we've come a long way, but it has to be said we have a long way to go, and by enshrining this in law, we'll hopefully get there. Also want to mention why I'm wearing my collar today. I, of course, am segueing back to church work, but I always wear my collar at Pride events, and I try to always wear my collar at events like this, because it's really important to show that people of faith, when they're truly faithful, all faiths are inclusive of LGBTQI2S folk.